Okay, we are live.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we're going to continue our discussion of H230, and we have 4 members of the Fish and Wildlife Department with us, 2 via Zoom, 2 in person. Welcome back.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for coming. Do you want to start or do you want to just start?
I guess, well, I can start. Interim Commissioner Andrea Shortsley, the department. And we saw the revisions that were made for section 6. And we just want to highlight, I think, one of the biggest kind of things that we wanted to bring up was just the listing of species in the bill may not be the best idea in terms of being able to be responsive to population changes.
All right, hold on a second.
Okay.
I'm not finding highlighted changes. Okay. And it says 416.
3.1?
3.1.
Uh,
416.
Draft I have says 3.2.
On my page, let's see.
Leaked version.
Yeah, it's not coming up as 3.2 on mine. Okay. Okay, now
Where'd you find that?
I had to close out, go back to our committee and start over. Refresh doesn't always work.
Okay,
So I went back to the legislative homepage and then go to our committee page.
okay. Under today's agenda?
Under Michael O'Grady's name today's date. You're just starting to look at the version 3.2 of H230 representing page 6.
And also having Luke and Roz on Zoom can let them kind of weigh in because I know that their time is a little harder to schedule here.
So maybe we should start with that because
Yeah.
what happened for us is we
Okay.
took testimony from Jim Andrews. We had committee discussion and we got to his recommendation of his preference
Mhm.
was no season. And he had particularly concerns with snapping turtles. And so it would be really good to hear from Luke
Right.
about just the status of the 3 species we've called out and discussed. Hear from all of you about your thoughts on it after that, and then go from there, maybe.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Representative Sackler.
I'd just also like to say that as I glance at this language, which I'm seeing for the first time,
Yeah.
I don't think it's exactly like what we
What we
had
asked.
just discussed. So before you start telling
Yeah.
us why it's a
Yeah.
problem, maybe we hear that other stuff.
Sorry, yeah.
I thought it would be
Also not trying to
helpful.
put it that way, but.
Yes, so helpful to just hear where we're at, where you're at, and
Okay.
then the language we'll match that to what we all figure out.
Perfect. Then yeah, I will pass it to Luke to talk about the species.
Hi, everybody. My name is Luke Groff. For the record, I'm a herpetologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department and A&R. So this morning I watched the committee discussion yesterday after the Colonel and Hannah spoke, and I saw a little bit of Jim's testimony. Just want to bring up a couple things. I'm not sure where the leopard frog came from. That was a surprise. And the species that we had discussed possibly being harvestable were the snapping turtle, because that is a harvested species right now. I can't imagine a lot of people harvest it. In my going on 6 years here, I've only run into one case where somebody was harvesting a snapping turtle, so I don't think it's a big portion of our population. And also frog legs. People do eat frog legs. It's typically bullfrogs because they're larger, so there's more meat on their legs. And in my 6 years, I think I've had 2 instances on a wildlife management area where there was evidence of some frog harvesting. So again, not happening often. So I'm not sure where the leopard frog came in. From my mind, it was the bullfrog, snapping turtle, and then the green frog, because the green frog looks very, very similar to a bullfrog. It's sometimes difficult for professionals to tell them apart, sometimes. So the thought there was to include the green frog just because of the difficulty to discern bullfrog and green frog. The leopard frog is a species that was commercially harvested up until 2018 or 2019 in Vermont in large numbers, but that is no longer happening or being permitted right now. I also
Sorry, what was
heard,
the last
yes.
said about leopard frog permitted? What about? Leopard frogs are no longer being harvested because
There was one individual, as far as I know, there was one individual up in Franklin County that would apply for a commercial collection permit, and I think he just aged out.
okay, thank you.
And these days, I don't know if we would, even if somebody did apply for another commercial collector permit, I'm not sure we would issue that. I also heard something about garter snakes during the previous testimony. I'm not sure where that came from. I don't think anybody harvests snakes for food, so we can probably disregard that one.
No, I think the question about garter snakes was if we go the path of not allowing the take of any reptile or amphibian other than perhaps the couple that we call out, what happens if someone either purposefully or inadvertently with their lawnmower kills a garter snake? That kind of a thing,
I see, okay.
you will. So that's maybe for the colonel, but back to the biologist for a second. The couple of concerns that Jim brought up, that he doesn't feel that bullfrogs are abundant across the state any longer. Well, I guess I'd like to go back. We had questions about what a common species was and how you calculate or measure kind of abundance or enough to harvest a reptile or amphibian.
That's a great question. In my mind, abundant ties into our S ranks. So every species has an S rank, which is associated with their rareness or commonness. And for an S5 species, they're common, widespread, and abundant. So in my mind, an abundant species is an S5 species. So the green frog, the bullfrog, and the snapping turtle are all S5 species. The leopard frog is an S4.
But well, I guess I'm just still curious, common, widespread, and abundant.
These S ranks are they're determined in part through the scientific advisory group that Jim Andrews chairs. They provide input, but ultimately it comes down to another staff who's our zoologist in the Natural Heritage program. And there's risk calculators and things to help calculate the S ranks, but it comes down to distribution, known population sizes, distributions, things like that, known threats to the species.
So it is a quantified calculation.
It is, yes. So
Okay.
yes, it is quantified. There's NatureServe, which our natural heritage database is run through NatureServe. They have an online calculator that's sort of standardized across states.
Okay.
So I was just going to say the bullfrog is one that the scientific advisory group thought about going from an S5 to an S4 species. So we recently ran that through the calculator, and it didn't, if I remember, it didn't quite meet the S4 standards. So it will likely stay an S5 species.
Representative Bartholomew.
And the 4 species we're talking about, S4 versus 5, can you tell me again? I didn't catch it.
Yeah, so here, let me just get you the exact definitions right now. So an S5 is common, or wide and abundant, and S4 is common to uncommon. Common to uncommon, apparently secure. It's locally common or widely scattered to uncommon, but not rare. some cause for long-term concern due to declines or other factors, or stable over many decades and not threatened but of restricted distribution or other factors. So there's a lot of variability in the S4 common to uncommon. So that's why I was sticking with S5.
All of these are S5, including the green frog?
The leopard frog is S4. So green frog, bullfrog, and snapping turtle are all S5.
And Jim, pointed out the longevity and the tolerance for toxins in the snapping turtle, and how well, I think they don't reproduce till like what, 17 or 20 years old or something. And so there's could potentially be a time lag in our understanding of the health of that population because of how long it lives. Can you comment on that?
No, that's absolutely true. So snapping turtles, they're long-lived, decades and decades and decades. They scavenge on carcasses. They scavenge on, carcasses that are higher up in the food chain. So bioaccumulation is a thing for snapping turtles. I don't harvest them. I would never. I would not eat them personally. But sorry, you had another question in there that I'm missing. But yes, so the snapping turtle. So my position is funded mostly through federal funds. So I am required to focus on species that are identified as species of greatest conservation need. So rare, threatened, endangered species. The snapping turtle is not one of those. So we don't have data on snapping turtle populations. The Atlas probably has the best data on snapping turtle populations, and I suspect it's not an age structure type of data. It's more distribution of where they occur. So anything about structures of young versus adults at a pond, we don't know.
I don't know how you would age a turtle. Can you age a turtle?
Yes, you can. There's
Killing it?
skeletal chronology is one way that's lab-based. Typically what people do is count the growth rings or annuli on the scutes or the plates on the turtle's back or belly. They get you so far. They're not, they're not exact by any means. And after 20 or so years, those annuli or those growth rings on a lot of species wear smooth, so you can't identify them. So it is very hard to identify the age of turtles.
I guess you could determine if they're over 20-ish by that. Representative Tagliavia.
With talking about snapping turtles and the bioaccumulation of heavy metals, do we have any data either in Vermont or nationally on any kind of poisonings from people consuming snapping turtle?
There is no data in Vermont that I'm aware of. There possibly could be some, across the country. I'm not aware of it, but that's not to say there isn't any. I don't know.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do members have further questions for Luke? Representative Bartholomew.
I remember reading, not recently, but that amphibians worldwide were showing an increasing prevalence of developmental defects from, I'm not sure what, environmental contaminants or ozone or something. Is that still the case, and we seeing that here?
So I believe that was an issue in the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. And it was here in Vermont. There was incidences of frogs with extra limbs, deformities, things like that. And that was, seen across the country. There were some studies. If I recall, my understanding is it wasn't there wasn't a smoking gun that came to it. It was it came down to pollution, like several causes, synergies between them. But I would have to look into that for sure. There was a study here in Vermont in the early 2000s I could share.
Is that not a problem anymore?
I don't hear of reports anymore, and I don't see limb deformities myself. So I think it was a period in time that has passed, mostly.
Representative North.
Yes, thank you for your presentation and wondering, as soon as we started mentioning the list that we had kind of centered on based on testimony we heard yesterday, the bullfrogs, leopard frogs, snapping turtles, you immediately jumped to this quantitative list of S categories, S5, S4, S3. Is that like an accepted standard that we maybe could use to here in lieu of identifying specific species? I'm wondering if there's if we can reference that. Is that like a long-term standard or is that something that's just Vermont specific or I mean, is that?
I'll let Luke answer that.
Sure, I can speak to S. I mean, S ranks, it's S stands for state ranks. So it's something we have, it's something other states have. There's global ranks too. So S ranks and G ranks are standard. It's not just Vermont that uses those. Whether that would be appropriate to include in the legislation, I would leave that to Commissioner Raz to speak to.
So, and what are those levels? There's like, I imagine 5, 1, 2, 3, 4,
Yeah.
5.
There-
Exactly, S1 through S5.
And what do each of them mean?
You can-
Okay,
we can make sure that you get like the written description of them.
Okay.
That might be a lot easier than,
Yeah.
yeah.
makes sense.
Representative Bakowitz.
Yeah, thank you. If I'm understanding you correctly, you are indicating that we don't have good information on the population abundance of snapping turtles because they're not considered threatened or endangered. And so those creatures we have better data for. So I guess my question then is, how do we go from one category to the other? How do we actually get to, a threatened or endangered status if we're not keeping tabs on the population sizes and what the populations, what the population dynamics are over time of a particular species?
Yeah, that's a great question. I believe the state with the Natural Heritage Database, we start monitoring species at the S3 level. So S3, S2, and S1, the rare, threatened, and endangered species. But S4 and S5, the more common species, we don't. A lot of the data that we do know about those species comes from Jim Andrews and the Herp Atlas. They keep records on all S1 through S5 species, so rare and common, and the number of towns, number of populations. A lot of that data comes through them, which we use to identify S ranks.
Okay, and to follow up, for a creature like the snapping turtle, which has such a long lifespan and such a slow reproductive rate, would it be possible for it to slip from S5 to S4 or S3 like relatively quickly, in which case we'd be playing catch up rather than sort of preserving it to begin with?
It's a good question. So snapping turtles are pretty ubiquitous across the state, statewide, fairly common. So what I could imagine being an issue more than them, disappearing is earlier recruitment not coming into the population. So like I talked about in my last testimony is the eggs are readily eaten by predators, and so are the juveniles. So we may have older adults in the population without the youngers coming up to replace them. And that would be really hard to know without data, for sure. But to go from an S5 to an S1 would likely take some time. And, we see, like I was surveying a wetland yesterday for another spot, for another species. And we see snapping turtles all the time. So I think there would be some red flags raised where when we're out in the wetlands and not seeing the snapping turtles would raise some red flags. But yeah, hopefully that's getting at your question.
I guess I'm just concerned that given how long it takes for these creatures to reproduce, that they're so slow that it would just I guess I made my point already. It's just easy for me it just seems like a special case where we might not be as concerned about preserving species at the S5 level and not worrying about them very much, because we know if we did see problems because of, human predation, that they would recover quickly once we stop that. But with this kind of creature, it seems like if people were taking these to a point where it was a problem and we didn't know, it would be really hard for them to recover in the wild. It would take, it would be a many decades long process.
I'll just interject right now, right now, we don't have any safety net or any regulation protecting these turtles or having any authority to keep them on the landscape. Like right now, people can shoot them, can take them, can harvest them at any limit without any repercussion. And they've been doing that essentially since snapping turtles have been here. And they are a widespread common species. So I think just to keep that in perspective, that like we're not asking to increase the harvest or loosen anything for protections on these turtles. We're actually asking to put some restrictions on. So I think just to keep that in perspective as we're talking about this stuff.
Yeah, this is very specific to these particular creatures in the future.
All right, further questions on the biology part? Representative Pritchard.
One of the things we talked about yesterday that we tossed around was, maybe having regulation and something to help the department. And one of the suggestions that I made was, I don't know, I don't want to create a lot of work, but, we're all trying to track things and have rough, how many people take snapping turtles? Nobody really knows. As just having an endorsement on your license, that you can click on and it doesn't cost you anything. And you can say, well, there's 30 people in the state that take snapping turtles. But I think, along what you said, there has been no limits. There has been no protections forever. And by doing this, it's only going to make this better for the snapping turtle. And it's still, to me, whether it's 35 or 40, if people do it and the resource is there, to me, it's a win-win. We're protecting the turtle, we're making it better, and we're not denying these people, just because I don't want to take snapping turtles and eat turtle soup, doesn't mean somebody else should be denied it because I don't like it. If the resource is there and it can be utilized and it doesn't harm the population, I think that's what we should do. I don't think anybody eats newts or, stuff like that. And if there's really no reason, we talked about protecting those things, all those other things. And that's how the garter snake came up because, nobody eats snakes. Why not protect these things when we can?
Yeah. And I think having, as you suggested, some kind of mechanism, whether it's an endorsement or a stamp or whatnot, would help us understand what people are harvesting.
Could I add something about the S ranks? I don't see a way to raise my hand.
Sure, absolutely. You don't need to. There's only 2 of you in the room, so okay.
For the record, Rosalind Renfrew, Wildlife Diversity Program, Fish and Wildlife Department. So the S ranks, just to go back to the S ranks for a minute, they're based on things like rarity and threats to the species and their trends. So they're not strictly numerical all the time, and a lot of times we lack the data. And a lot of times it's expert opinion rather than hard data because we just don't have it. That said, it's expert opinion that have a pretty good sense of what's going on the ground. Someone like Luke and like 4 other people like him in Vermont who, him and Jim and others who have a really good sense. So you have to use what data you have and fill in the rest with your opinion based on your expertise. And so I just don't want you to I don't want you to have the impression that the S ranks are purely numerical and that we have all the information and all the data and we just run a calculation and we've got and then an S rank comes out of it. It's more nuanced than that. But what it does speak to is how important it is to have monitoring programs like the Amphibian Atlas, because it does help us gather at least some sense of that information for a lot of species, and a lot of those rely on citizen scientists. I also just want to point out how important the scientific advisory groups are. like the one that Luke and Jim are on, because they are the body of experts that provide the information. And then the State Wildlife Action Plan is sort of that every 10-year plan that takes all that into account and figures out what the species needs. So this is sort of the reason why it's so important to monitor a lot of what's out there, because we need that information to assess, is it an S5 or is it going up to an S4? It's just really hard. Monitoring isn't very exciting to sort of advertise for or to promote. It's year after year, year in, year out, but it's super important. So I just really wanted to highlight that because I think you're seeing how that comes to bear on decisions like that.
Representative Sakowicz.
Yeah, and I apologize to everybody for getting us like just a little bit on a tangent here, but this does seem pertinent. When we're talking about these rankings, do they take into account like declines in species, which as being a concern, even if the species is abundant? So like maybe there's a bird that, 50 years ago, you couldn't like walk 2 feet without seeing, and now you have to walk 20 feet to see it. So it's, it's only 10% as common as it used to be, but they're still everywhere. Like, would that show up in the rankings somehow? Does that show up as a concern when you're thinking about how to manage these species?
Yes, we look at trends. So whether or not you can detect those trends depends on for how long we've been monitoring, right? So some of the most robust data we have are for birds. They have the best data. Everybody's jealous of the bird data because they've been monitored across the country since 1969. And so we have great trend data for the big picture and even at the state level for a lot of species. So you can really look at the very long-term declines. If you see a decline, you've only been collecting data for 10 years, you still take that decline seriously. You just don't know where they used to be 20 years ago, right? So you have to you take what you get and then you work with that. Does that help?
Yes, but I'm also wondering, like, how does that translate into the rankings? So if there was a bird that was, incredibly abundant in 1969, and now it's only 10% is abundant, but there's still lots of them. Like there's no immediate threat that they're going to become extinct. Would that affect their ranking, or are they still S5 because they're everywhere and it doesn't look like they're going to go extinct anytime, in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And there's a lot of context to that. So if there was a species that had already, there's a lot of species out there that have already declined by quite a bit. And now we're just looking at, we're at a starting point where before we had any hard data, they probably declined, or maybe they increased. Forest birds here, compared to 100 years ago, have probably increased. So we're now looking at their declines or increases or changes since about 1970 when we started collecting data. So we're mostly using those numbers because that's what we have data for, but they always have to be in the context of what changes have we seen on the landscape. So if we've seen Vermont become reforested and we see black-throated blue warblers increasing because they're a forest bird, we can understand what's going on. If we're not losing forest in Vermont, but they start tanking, then that's a problem. That's going to raise alarms, and that might raise the X rank higher.
Thank you.
All right, so your thoughts on our changed approach here?
Well, I didn't have a lot of time to really dive in, similar to, I guess, you all. And I asked the major to come with me just from his experience of writing rules and the perspective of, regulation. I think the intent of the original language in the bill was giving the commissioner authority to set a regulated season. And that can, having that authority with the commissioner with oversight of the Species Advisory Group, the SAG, makes that a little more nimble than having it sit in statute. So if there are trends being noticed, if populations are changing, you know, from either the atlas or from Luke's work, that can be adjusted really quickly rather than coming back and forth through legislation. So I think that was kind of one of the biggest things that we noticed. Additionally, I think the way that it's written, there would basically be a gap between the commissioner writing a rule.
We have a squirrel who would like to join the test. Every year we.
And then just the importation and possession permitting authority. I think that language needs to get just needs to coincide a little bit better.
What does that mean, coincide?
Well, it looks like there's a gap. The way that it's written, Hannah highlighted for me, the way that the new draft is written, it would effectively suspend the importation and possession permitting authority and the ability to harvest a species for food until the department has adopted a new rule. So in the language that we proposed, the rulemaking authority was discretionary and intentionally did not conflict with the current importation permitting authority. And so there's no gap in between until a new rule is passed.
No, but that's actually because we put a moratorium on the taking of reptiles and amphibians. That's our intent, was to pause them all until you promulgated rules.
I think, if I may, I think in the original bill, it prohibited taking and collection. And in this recent writing, it's including possession and import. And I think that that's redundant with these other statutes that Andrea was reading. So 4709 and
Title 10, Section 18.
Appendix section 18. I think it's running into those. So I think it might be a matter of Mr. O'Grady looking at it and seeing if that's an issue.
Okay, but just the general concept of where we intended to go,
Mhm.
you're open to that and we can pursue it a little. We'll get O'Grady in here and walk through it and probably have Hannah look at it again too and just see where we're at. But
Yeah.
I want to make sure we were heading in a direction that, and it's definitely our intent to keep the pieces that you mentioned around the importation and the grandfathering of existing
Mhm.
pets. And I think the rulemaking is as nimble as it was, although it does, it's calling out particular species, which we will change based on Luke's testimony today. And includes also flexibility around non-native and native species that the commissioner finds to be an issue in the future. Colonel, do you have a comment?
I couldn't see it, so I just moved over.
I know. Okay, great. That's good. Other questions? Representative Pritchard?
Yeah. So I mean, are you okay with, what our intent was as far as protecting all reptiles, amphibians with exclusion of those three? Because that's what we had talked about.
In theory, yes, like I'm supportive of protecting all of the reptiles and amphibians. From what I understand, it just, with the way that some of these species are trending, that it's the process of having something changed in statute is so much slower than having a rule that goes through the commissioner's authority is. And so if there's any sort of change in a species that, like,
Would elevate it to an S5?
Well, no, I would say elevate it to like, or decrease it to say an S3. So say right now there's question whether bullfrogs, if they're trending downwards. The way that this is written now, we'd have to, if we've decided that bullfrogs were trending down and we wouldn't want them to be harvested any longer, we'd have to come back and it would have to be a statutory change because it's the species is listed. But if it was, I believe that if it was listed as kind of the way that we had proposed in the original draft, it was a commissioner's rule. It could go through rulemaking, which can start at any time, go through the public process, and then be addressed in a much quicker fashion.
Okay, I think though, I hear your concern. We'll make sure we address it.
Okay.
And I think it's up the line 5, rules adopted by the Commissioner of the Fish and Wildlife under this section shall be designed to maintain the best health population and utilization levels of the regulated reptile or amphibian. What I'm hearing you say is you want to be sure that also allows stopping the season.
Correct. Yes. And I think, and
Of course, that's what we want you to have.
yeah,
That's our intent.
yeah. And then maybe the major can offer some insight here too, but the commissioner we can have a season of 0, a limit of 0. And that can be, if it sits with the commissioner's authority, it can be changed much quicker.
Yeah.
So that's accurate.
Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely want to protect all of the species, all of the herp species, and we just felt like that was a more nimble, quicker way.
Further questions? Representative Austin?
So what happens when we're out of season? When we're out of the legislature? What happens with your authority?
With my authority,
Mhm.
it remains the same.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
But if something happened with an animal
Mhm.
and we had it a certain way, and it was the legislature that had to make that decision, what happens?
My understanding is that we would have to go through the same process that we are going through now. So wait until a bill gets picked up, addressed. Correct.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right, further thoughts? Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Were there
May I
any
say
other?
one-
Yes, you may.
Okay, one last thing I was gonna say about the bill, potential revision, on page 7, at the very last line, number 19, it talked about about waivers for possession for prohibited species legally acquired as a pet prior to July 1st, 2025.
So
So-
it's there.
Yes, I think that's great having that waiver, but I chair the import team. So if this all goes through, we may not, there's background things we have to do before we restrict the pond slider, like getting a hold of pet shops and things like that. So I'm just curious what happens to a pet slider that's acquired legally, say on August 1st, and then we restrict the species in say 2027, like those species that are acquired legally after July 1st, 2025 and before the restriction.
Yeah, that's language that you all brought us.
Yeah, so in my mind, I could just see changing July 1st to the date the species becomes restricted or something like that. That makes sense. Only other thing I was gonna bring up is somebody brought up the wanton waste law during the discussion yesterday. I don't believe reptiles and amphibians will be included in the wanton waste law because they're not a game quadruped animal, which I believe is defined in statute. So something I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, the wanton waste bill is definitely for regulated species. It includes fur bearers as well. And that was part of how we got to this conversation was that I don't know if we need to revisit it, but that's part of how we did get to this idea that, well, we should actually not be allowed because of what the commissioner started out by reminding us of, which is that currently people can take any of these species. And we're trying to put some boundaries around that now in a logical way. is so interesting with fish and wildlife.
It's a evolving process.
All right, I just want, while you're all here, I'm just looking back through, making sure. Anyone else have thoughts on the bill or feel like we keep coming back to sections of it? I'm learning more about it as we get closer to trying to move it out of committee, so just want to make sure. Anything else that folks have on their minds related to this bill? All right. Thank you again.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We are.
No problem.
We are, and yeah, Commissioner, if you could hang on, I'd love to
Oh.
talk to you after, no, but
Oh, okay.
after, but right now I want to just say that Judiciary Committee is looking at H86 right now, so hopefully we'll hear back from them, but for now, we're not scheduled again until tomorrow morning after the floor. And it's actually at 10:30, so there's actual time because it's out of, I think it's someone joining us by Zoom. Are they joining by Zoom tomorrow? So anyway, presentation then, but I hope we'll have some updates on H86 also. For now, we're adjourned. We're adjourned for the day.
Thank you.